Well, good morning, everyone.
Oh, it was because it was moving.
Welcome to another Hull & Hull Estates breakfast. We want to thank you all for coming out on such a beautiful day, and to those who are calling in or on the webcast, thank you for joining us today. I'd like to introduce a few of the members from our firm. In addition to Ian and Susanna, who will be speaking today, we have David Smith, our partner, Natalia Angelini, Holly LaValliant, Suman Jaffrey, and we have our law clerks, Christine Mercer, Heather McGuinness, Sarah Kozlicki is in the hall, and Heather Frykowski, and our student Noah Weisberg as well. So today we're going to be hearing about the testing for capacity and undue influence, and although we start out with a quote from the Bible, we're not going to be preaching to you. We're just going to be walking you through this very difficult area that we often encounter. So with that, I'll turn matters over to Ian and Susanna.
Do you want to stay on the inside? Well, because then okay.
Well, that's great. Thanks, Paul. And always like to start our programs with a good biblical reference. I forgot about that. That's good. All right. So what we're going to try to do today is take some time, and we've got microphones, and we've got, I think, abilities to ask questions and to jump in. Not be afraid of some dialogue on the points here. Staying focused on the general concept of how we are to take and receive instructions and alerting ourselves to issues of capacity and undue influence. And where are we going to see what Susanna is proudly showing as red flags?
I had to dress for the occasion.
But what are the red flags that the courts are expecting us to do and to manage? I was preparing for this today. We sort of thought we'd look at a few elements of it. First of all, never forgetting the core elements of wills, instructions, and the kinds of issues we're going to have to concern ourselves with. Look at some of the Substitute Decisions Act provisions that help us inform ourselves, not just in a context of capacity assessment for an SDA scenario, but also it helps inform us on what sorts of language the courts will rely on in looking for capacity, keeping mindful of these whole classic scenarios with the Banks and Goodfellows analysis and so on. And then at other elements of it, we want to talk about some of the ethical considerations that tie into privilege, confidentiality, and the kinds of steps we want to take there. So just starting off, it seems to me, one of the things that strikes me is remarkable is whenever we're taking instructions from our clients for wills, when we're in a trial, we litigation lawyers, the information that we want to pull out of the file and from the surrounding circumstances, so to speak, it always seems a bit remarkable to me, because we will take things like diary entries, or we will take comments from third-party attendees at hospitals, social workers, and so on, and we will make our case around those facts. That being supported fundamentally by the lawyer's evidence. Because at the end of the day, the last line of attack is, of course, the lawyer's evidence in terms of what a judge is going to rely on. But it is remarkable, and one of the things I always remind myself whenever you're taking instructions, how important things that you don't even know are in the room are going to end up being in the trial. And I literally use the example of diary entries where a nice old lady writes notes in her diary for, it's a recent British case, notes in her diary for about 20 years, and they get progressively more bizarre over the years, and the diary entries were the turning point for the judge in determining whether or not this woman had capacity, notwithstanding the fact she'd seen a lawyer, and notwithstanding the fact that they had some modest medical records. So that seems to me to be one of those illustrations of that we can only go so far in our information gathering. And we can be blindsided, essentially, as this case was. The lawyers that lost the will challenge were because the diary entries ended up being the most profound piece of evidence.
And that's really an interesting comment, too, because we know that during these kinds of cases, the evidence is going to be threefold in the sense that we've got the layperson's evidence, we've got the medical evidence if it's available, and then we've got the lawyer's evidence. And even though we're testing for things like capacity and undue influence, it's not always going to be the medical expert that's going to carry the day. And I think a lot of people find that quite surprising because notwithstanding the fact that many times we rely on that kind of evidence, at the end of the day, whether or not someone has capacity is a legal test, and that's what the court has to determine.
So knowing the legal test is there, and that's a good bank's a good fellow start. No good will challenge case is decided without reference to that. Knowing and understanding the nature and effect of your dispositions and those who might naturally be dependents and would enjoy the bounty of your estate. So that case, of course, is a little spicy because in that case, the individual testator was alleged to be insane. So the allegation was so far across the board in terms of capacity. But to starting point, it seems to me that's helpful as a lawyer when I'm on the intake point in time is to look at what the medical analysis to capacity is. Not to say that we don't still have to understand the basic Banks and Goodfellow, but Dr. Shulman, who's a learned and probably Canada's expert on retrospective and on capacity assessment, what he describes, I think, is very illustrative as to how we analyze each and every case. And it's a formula that, it seems to me anyway, is very helpful. So why don't we just spend a couple minutes talking about the sort of formula or the chart analysis that Dr. Shulman uses as the basis for which he says we should be dealing with capacity.
Dr. Shulman basically provides that capacity is both task and time specific. And so we've got sort of a range of the level of capacity that's going to be required depending on the nature of the transaction and the circumstances that are surrounding the individual making that decision at that particular time. Now, we don't have the benefit of having some kind of chart that we can illustrate to you, but if you sort of think in your mind in terms of a traditional kind of chart, and you've got the level of cognition, or he calls it the emotional stability that would be required to make a decision and have the capacity for that, and then the situational complexity. And if you graph that, you'll see that there's a correlation and sort of this gray zone that runs through the middle, which we as practitioners are often struggling with. And then the idea being that depending on what it is that you're being assessed for, the level of cognition is going to depend on your situation.
And it ties into all of the fundamental legal principles that we do. That is, of course, when we're sitting down, the level of cognition is fact specific. Like every case starts off, we always say every case turns on its facts. So Dr. Shulman says task specific is the key element. That is the facts. And situational specific. So we take those two words, and they're just the doctor using words that we use in law. And he says if you've got a low stress situation where a client is coming in with moderate changes to their will, regardless of age, ability, and so on, if it's a low expectation of the change, the situational complexity is modest, so you can have a fairly low level of cognition. And what the judges get grumpy with us in the courts is that if we didn't identify the level of complexity, because you can never analyze the capacity, as in Dr. Shulman's view, without understanding the level of complexity. And that's the lawyer's job. Our job is to determine the level of complexity of this particular individual. We're always alerted, and the easy red flag is the level of complexity of the need to elaborately change the will. For example, that comes in and says, I want to now do an estate freeze. I'm 93 years old, and I want to do a triple butterfly, and I got Thorson's opinion here. We're going to do a great complex tax planning. That, as a lawyer, we're naturally going to be seeing as a red flag to make sure that we test cognition and so on. But if it's coming in with a simple change of executor, or a simple change adding a beneficiary, then we are able to, and Dr. Shulman says, we're able to expect a lower level of cognition. And it makes sense. So if that's the case, where our expectation still comes down to in his chart is situational complexity. So we need to identify how complex our situation is. Then we come back to say how much cognition do you need to make your will. And that's really the formula that he is using that it is, I just think I mean, maybe, hopefully it sounds a little clearer in some ways. So what are we going to do to identify situational complexity? Well, one of the things we've done in our paper is give you a copy of all of the kind, not all, but the kinds of questions that we will ask at a discovery. So when we're sitting across the table from the lawyer who drew the will, typically, but also from the witnesses, what kind of questions are we going to be expecting? And that, I think, helps identify, at least from your perspective when you're drawing the will, the kinds of attacks that are going to come at you. But the second part of it, and we're going to spend some time today on, is what is the undue influence elements out there? Because that's where the courts will say you should have, if they find undue influence, you should have tested situational complexity. You should have understood that there was more undue influence swirling around the room than was present. And the BC Law Reform Commission and the Law Institute, we've got some materials in there, have some really great tools to help us tease out questions of undue influence. So starting with our task-specific criteria and the Shulman, sort of what he describes as the rules of engagement, he goes on to say, look at core elements of, and we're not just dealing with checklists anymore, core elements of the individual. And the first one he says is, talk about social circumstances of the testator. And that will help you identify your situational complexity. And the social circumstances, of course, for an elderly testator might be just how much interaction are you having with the rest of the world, and who are you having that interaction with, and drilling down with hard questions. And we're going to come back to how hard the questions have to be when you start testing for undue influence, because that's where you can really bring out the information.
And the key here is that when we're meeting with our clients, of course, we always think our client is capable. No matter how old or how young they are, we think that they're there because they want to do something. And the difficulty with undue influence is that people who are undue influencers are really good at what they do. And so they're very covert, and it's not going to be an easy situation, unless they're very poor undue influencers, of them showing up and being overtly in the face of that individual during the will giving, the instructions during the process. And so what we're really looking for is sort of indicia of the red flags, as Ian alluded to. What kind of things are we looking for when we meet with individuals and we have some concerns? Something has alerted us to the possibility that something's going on here. So just being able to identify some of the issues that tend to arise, I think, helps us when we're sitting there in these difficult, sometimes, situations.
So knowing the matrix exists, that we have sort of levels of capacity, and that's where the Substitute Decisions Act comes in. It's in handy, because it's clear that the highest level of cognition expected is to do a will. Then the Substitute Decisions Act gives us abilities to be a little more flexible on level of cognition, because it says, okay, for power of attorney for property, it's probably a little less than a will, and then for personal care, it's even less. So you've got the matrix already there established by the legislation. So obviously, our first question is, what are we going to do? Well, lots of times our instructions are in respect of doing wills and powers of attorney. So if that's the combined retainer that we're facing, then our matrix is, like Dr. Shulman says, what's our situational complexity for that? Power of attorney, that's not overly complex of a concept for someone to understand and for us to explain. Nature of the will depends on the instructions we're getting. So knowing the matrix is part and parcel of it. These medical considerations that Dr. Shulman talks about, he keeps coming back to, are looking at things like the social circumstances. Then he starts to say, look at physical factors. So again, these are easy things for a judge to, or us to be embarrassed at a trial. I can tell you there's lots of discoveries that I've done, and if I don't have it written down to ask, I mean, were there any hearing problems, right? Were there any eyesight problems? The classic is language, because that's an easy identifiable. But Shulman identifies that, again, we can't miss our situational complexity of the individual physically. If they come in a wheelchair, maybe we start to think of mobility. But if we're not putting it in our checklist to test and to understand, what are your day-to-day activities? Do you go to the mall? Do you come out shopping with your grandson? Do you do sort of activities that you can start to drill down on? We can help us understand the physical, non-cognitive, but physical factors that we need to consider. So now that Shulman has got us into these sort of what are essentially maybe medical scenarios, we can work backwards and start relying on our individual strengths as lawyers. And the Law Society rules to allow us to get verification is a great window, for especially with elderly people. You can pull out a lot more information. You can say, look, I'm required to get your ID. And you can pull out the ID, and you can use that moment in time to be testing things like short-term memory and so on. When's your birthday? Oh, that's kind of neat. I was born in April 2 or something like that. You can engage them with that step. The nature of the retainer also allows you to tease out the situation for undue influence, using the fact that, are we sitting in the room, or were you driven by someone? Okay, well, let's make sure we understand. You're paying the bill, right? And walking through who's functioning the actual retainer and who's the active retainer participants. Those are, again, things that we can do easily. We often find it difficult to ask some of these questions or to determine the nature and extent of some of these personal circumstances, and we can use what we have to ask as our starting points.
Another interesting conversation that we try to focus on is the talk about the need for confidentiality, especially when you've got a husband and a wife situation or a parent with a child in the room. Having that opportunity to explain why it's necessary to have the individual be in a confidential environment just with the lawyer so that these discussions can be had is a precursor to these kinds of situations as well.
And it's the nature, and again, we're trained to looking for red flags, but it's a question of how we look for red flags, and it's the nature of the questioning that we're doing as well. We're not throwing out, we want to be careful about leading questions. We want to be careful about using open-ended opportunities to really start to flush out what the client wants. Yes or no answers are in and of itself possibly a red flag. All of these illustrations are illustrations that have been thrown back on solicitors in the cases. So they're not things that we're sort of making up along the way. The judges will put their hook on. It comes back to the diary entries. The judge hangs their hat on diary entries. The judge might hang their hat easily on the nature of the questions that were asked and how they were asked, just as much as for example, as a diary entry. So it helps us, and again, we really keep coming back to the expectations of the court, but we're also not forgetting our ethical obligations that, of course, we don't want to swirl around in, and that is, of course, we don't want to get to the point where we are taking instructions that someone other than a court is going to be reviewing, and that, of course, is our regulator and the Law Society, because they might say, look, you've got to hit a minimum of competence under the rules. Rule 2 says you've got to have competence and all that sort of stuff. What is our level of competence? And that may sound a bit alarming, but how many times we have seen cases where we've got lawyers' notes that are a half a page long, and the lawyer, of course, is going to say and give great strong evidence about how much undertaking that they did in terms of testing capacity, but there's not another shred of note to illustrate any of that. And as a side point, it starts to put us into exposures. Is that a level of competency? So that's met the standard that maybe some other entity will be looking at us and giving us some criticism for. So, having said that, and on that happy note, let's spend some time on some of the undue influence developments, because they definitely feed into the whole question of capacity as well. So, from that standpoint, we're expected to delineate and determine whether or not the question of confidentiality has been fully canvassed with the client and to what extent has been canvassed. And confidentiality underscores all of the elements of undue influence. We need to know if this client is walking out of the hall and getting a ride home and being badgered and told that they're going to eat cat food if they don't change their will. We need to know whether or not we at least tried and explored those kinds of inquiries as to what kind of relationships are around them. Because the undue influence elements are the things that are not only they're hard to find out, they're always done in secret. So if we can tease out those issues, it can go a long way. So how do we tease them out? One of the ways we tease them out is look at good resources. And the British Columbia stuff that we've got in the materials attached there, I think, is a really important checklist that helps us tease out the question of undue influence.
And if we just look at that checklist, I mean, the easiest illustration and the place to start with, of course, is just to start with an interview with the individual alone. making sure that they're in the room and that we're asking these questions, these open-ended questions that allow them to really speak about what it is that they want and why they've come to us with these instructions or the instructions that they're providing us with. And the reality is that, we don't always know that we've got a potential minefield in terms of the situation, and having the opportunity to spend the time with the client to explore their thoughts and the rationales will give us that opportunity to look for some of these red flags.
So there are 4 elements of undue influence that really, categories that really help me understand what sort of areas I can exploit or look into. One is exploiting dependencies, and that is really drilling down on what dependencies exist or don't exist for the individual.
Another one is when you see situations of potential abuse of relationships of trust and confidence. Classic scenario where someone is in a position where they can influence someone either professionally, financially, or even emotionally, and having that relationship identified and explored is pretty important.
So this isolation is the easiest one, and that's the one that we're going to talk a little bit about. What are the cases doing with undue influence and what are they looking for? But isolation is another foundation of it, and tied to that, of course, is the emotional manipulation. So what are some illustration points on undue influence? Where we have a note that we can say we asked to tough questions. And again, it is not something that is always easy for us to do. So we try to use the early part of the interview to soften up this area of inquiry, because the question of undue influence requires direct and sometimes tough questions, like, does anybody hurt you? Do you feel threatened in any way? Do you, when you are starting to see red flags, do you ask the tough questions and directly to see where the client is going to take you in regard to that? And whether we can get the answers that we want to help us flush out the issue is not almost always the problem. The problem is that if we haven't asked the tough questions, we can be later criticized. So those are, has anyone ever taken anything from you without asking? Those kinds of questions. Are you ever afraid? What do you like to do, and who do you like to see? Do you ever wish to stop associating with anyone? Has anyone ever tried to stop associating with you? And what happened in those circumstances? Those kinds of tough questions. And where we see some really interesting illustrations is this checklist, because the British Columbia Law Institute guide, it provides its recommended practices, and then there's also the guide of it's the guide to undue influence, and it talks about recognition and prevention. It's not just in British Columbia the guide is focusing on not just finding the flags but talking about prevention. But it seems to me that realistically we are out there trying just to make sure that the flag, if there are illustrations or there are concerns of undue influence, we need to be focused on the recognition. Although prevention is a lofty goal, it can be hard to do it from where we're sitting in the chair.
And I think just on that note, it might make sense to just sort of identify some of those classic situations where we find ourselves in a position where we probably do have to probe a little bit more beyond what we're being told by clients, because all of us know that elderly clients can have all the social graces, they can say all the right things and present very well. And it's not until and unless you really start to probe and delve into some of these questions, some of these tough questions, as Ian says, that you can really get a sense for what's going on.
And again, it's an easy sell, I find, with clients to say, why are you getting into this? And at the end of the day, when you say, well, look, we want this will to stand. And the first question that you can start to drill down with, that we think can be effective, is just keep talking about why. Why are you making the dispositions? Why are you changing the dispositions? Or why is it that you're not changing the dispositions? If you can take that starting point, it really forces the client to start answering questions that maybe coming in there they weren't even prepared to consider or discuss. So what we find with this checklist is really helpful, because first of all it starts off with the rationale. So ensuring that the rationale makes sense, and that drills right down to the why. And that answers your situational complexity chart directly. The next area that we would that they remind us on is, of course, stay away from the leading, ask non-leading open-ended questions, which we've already talked about. But then start to develop what they talk about is a watch for red flags, and they really talk about the characteristics of undue influencers. Like, is the individual overly helpful? is that could be possibly undue influencing. In BC, they even talk about actually having an opportunity to speak with the person who brought the individual to the lawyer's office in an independent way as well, just saying on the way out the door, just sort of asking some general questions to determine whether or not this person is creating what is essentially a scenario of happiness for this individual in the public, but is in the process of essentially undue influencing. They also talk about this idea that we're expected to have this ability to have a gut check, a gut feeling about what's going on, and that's obviously comes with experience. That's easy to say, but almost impossible from a practice standpoint to teach, and so that's something that all we can do is learn as we go along.
And another thing is we're listening to what our clients are telling us during these interviews and these meetings. There may be that they've identified other people that we should consider talking to as well. And with their consent, of course, they might be someone that you may want to consult afterwards just to do that double check if you've got that gut feeling, that concern that maybe something more needs to be done beyond just the first meeting with the client.
All right, so we've talked a little bit about the parameters of undue influence and some of the tools to help tease out not just undue influence questions, but capacity questions. So let's spend a few minutes just talking a little bit about what the courts have been doing with undue influence and what they have said are important elements to determine a finding of undue influence. And remembering the classic decisions like Scott and Cousins, where Justice Cullity emphasizes in the bold almost that we're not as lawyers expected to play God. What we are as lawyers expected to do is undertake this comprehensive analysis. And in Scott and Cousins, they found there was undue influence, and they found that in that case the lawyer had not sufficiently made inquiries in respect of the undue influence.
And I think the case law makes it clear that there's definitely a distinction between influence and what the legal test of undue influence is as being a grounds for challenging a will, because people can be influenced, and as children we influence our parents on a regular basis, and that is permissible. Undue influence is impermissible, and that is when there's an element of coercion, of arm twisting, of some kind of making someone do something against their will, which is very different from just regular influence.
And with the question of undue influence from a substantive standpoint, the courts have made it clear that they have an inquisitorial role when faced with the issue of undue influence. And so, again, if a court has an inquisitorial role, then you can imagine that they're going to impose that at even a higher expectation on counsel who are taking instructions to be taking on that inquisitorial active listening and active questioning role. So that special relationship was talked about by Cullity, for example, in the Otis decision, where he said, look, you can't just come to the court and tell us what we're going to do. We still have a governing role over the process of validity of wills and the like. So this inquisitorial role is allowing the courts to have full inquiry, and it talks about, in Otis, he talked about full inquiry into the circumstances affecting the validity of a will. Well, if that's the case, then of course we have that in spades, for sure. So, in terms of the undue influence, the test, as Susanna talks about, we're requiring coercion. The coercion to make a gift, in lots of respects, depends on timing. And again, that when we're facing instructions for a will, the timing is obviously then when the instructions are being given to essentially affect the gift on death. Is there a question of, very different questions get asked when the gifting is happening inter vivos. And the expectations of the court approach a gifting inter vivos very differently. So if we're asked to act in a scenario where the gifting is being done inter vivos, we can't forget what the court is going to do, and they're going to flip some of the rules right on us in an inter vivos scenario.
And then it takes us back, of course, to the Shulman analysis about the situation that the individual is in when they're making these decisions. It could be that, depending on the individual, a lower level of coercion in a particular situation, a high tension situation, may be sufficient to amount to undue influence. And this is where we struggle as practitioners in knowing, when is good enough good enough?
So, tying into this inter vivos scenario, of course, the court will say that there's a presumption of undue influence. So if we're going to create a situation where we're going to affect the gifting inter vivos and we have any reason to believe that the red flags are there, we always want to be very careful that we come back around and been fortified, ready to address what is essentially the flipped onus on us. So what is indicia of coercive behavior that the courts have sort of toyed with is, I think, sort of interesting.
And the easiest one is, of course, when you've got a situation where the first initial meeting is arranged by someone else other than the testator. So a neighbor, a caregiver, a friend brings this individual in and says, this individual wants to give some will instructions.
In some of the leading cases, another indicia is obviously determining where control and management of another's affairs is being undertaken. So again, easy areas of inquiry when you're taking instructions in respect of anything relating either inter vivos or testamentary. Who's looking after the banking? Who goes to the bank? Do you take your mom to the bank? Do you get taken to the bank? How is it working on a day-to-day basis? Are you doing online banking, which is where tremendous abuse and fraud can occur? Those kinds of inquiries are worth it because it is a huge indicia on the undue influence side.
Another one, of course, being just the way that the meeting itself is conducted. Who's in the room? Who's reviewing drafts, perhaps? Who's providing additional instructions or clarifying the individual's instructions? How much of an active role does someone else have other than your client?
And that ties into really, there's a positive and a negative when clients come in and they say they've got sort of swarming professional advisors around them. They've got a financial advisor, they've got an accountant, now they've got a lawyer, they may have other professional advisors, an insurance agent, all of whom may have been part of their financial life and professional life over the years. So that it can be a positive and a negative. And part of that can be as well as determining whether those professional advisors are actively suggesting and overly actively suggesting gifting. And we've seen it lots of times in the cases where a professional advisor might get a little zealous about making sure that his or her personal favorite charity is being looked after under the will, and to what extent is that professional advisor actually influencing, or is it undue influencing that gifting to the exclusion of, for example, maybe the family to a large extent. So the professional advisor's roles is another area where the courts have really teased out indicia for undue influence.
One that I've recently come across is just the importance of the cultural background of the client. There may be things that, based on where that individual comes from, ethnically or even financially and even emotionally, that may have something to do with how they're going to react to the will instructions and their plans for how they want to distribute their estate. And having some of these expectations that are in their mind but not necessarily something that's known to us can make it more difficult to really understand in some situations why they're planning to do what they're doing.
Another area that is an easy red flag after the fact, but not always easy to identify during the process of giving instructions and taking and receiving instructions, is a question of whether or not the activity or the transaction is indeed a self-dealing transaction. And how often we run into is a scenario where someone who is a good fiduciary, the good daughter, is enjoying a benefit while holding a power of attorney and receiving a substantial sum, $100,000 as a gift. And mom says, that gift is what I wanted to do, and I want it to happen during lifetime, and I want you, lawyer, to make sure it happens. And all the steps are taken, presumably carefully. The maybe even get a deed of gift organized, which is something we always strongly recommend in situations that you can. But ultimately, is it always going to be cloaked with and clouded over by the fact that it's a self-dealing transaction? The fact that she is a fiduciary and she's receiving a gift in that moment. So we struggle with whether or not we can almost ever defend a self-dealing transaction when you've given that dutiful child the power of attorney. And again, it will in large part depend on not as much as the showman. This is where the doctors sort of have to be put to the side, but this is the whole question of self-dealing transactions and what's a court going to do to that transaction. And on balance, the court is going to be, should be, quite critical of that, notwithstanding all the situational sensibilities of the gift. So self-dealing transactions, whether they smell rotten or they are rotten, are an important indicia of the undue influence testing as well.
And I think in light of the recent case law that says that fiduciaries have to account in some situations right from the date of the power of attorney, let alone, you know, from the time that they actually start actively acting, could be a real issue for people when these kinds of gifts are made during the lifetime. So the fact that, you know, a power of attorney is granted to a daughter but is parked for the next 20 years until it has to be invoked, but in that 20-year span, mom and dad decide to reward daughter with, you know, a gift, as Ian says, of $100,000. It may be at that point that even though the power of attorney was never, you know, actually invoked, that a judge may find that, you know what, you were an attorney, you had a duty to account, and receiving that gift during that time frame was a conflict.
All right, and again, don't feel free if people want to jump up to a microphone and ask something or engage in a little dialogue here. We're still sort of drilling down on some of this indicia, which is easily identifiable to undue influence, but is a fundamental element of testamentary capacity as well. John, please, don't hesitate.
Thank you, Ian. I'm interested in the self-dealing issue. It seems to me that if you have a self-dealing issue, such as you're describing, wouldn't the answer, or partly the answer, be to communicate with the others who have an interest? I recommend many times when we're not leaving 3 children equal shares, tell them right away. Send them a copy of the will. Sometimes you have a resistant client, but send them a copy of the will. Make sure everybody knows now's your chance. Make your objections, because daughter is getting $100,000. We want to do it, and make your objection now, because it's going to be too late down the road. So that's one way I might suggest you can avoid the self-dealing issue, especially if the courts are going to criticize you. Comments?
Well, it's a great suggestion, and it's fundamental to this whole idea that, I mean, at the end of the day, if someone's going to accuse your client of having been undue influence by another, that transparency is almost fatal to the allegation. If you know, if even if it's not communication and not dialogue, but it's communication, it underscores the importance of where really at the end of the day it deflates all of the other cloistering and all of the other sort of criteria we're talking about when there is exposure to the act. And that's why I also like the idea of almost, you know, tying this up with a bow and deed of gift and those kinds of extra steps, because the more we expose the events, the less anyone can say that the undue influencing happened in secret, and that it was overbearing, and that it was uncontrollable, and that it couldn't have been responded to. And the classic undue influence is the old adage that they just literally hold the door. You know, you go to knock and see your grandmother, and they won't let you in the door. And how, you know, certainly we've seen that lots of times. But when you're sitting here, and so communication can't, I mean, dialogue can't occur, but communication can occur. So that's a very important distinction, John, and one of those things that our clients almost always want to resist, because it will maybe inflame the discussions or inflame things and bring our situational complexity out to this end. Because this nice grandmother before was quietly just going to do this and act as she saw fit without anyone ever knowing until she died. But you're increasing your situational complexity, where then Shulman says, well, then you better have your cognition up. It can't be situationally complex and have low cognition, or you're not going to meet the test of testamentary capacity. But that helps a lot, and then you can start to bolster that with things like getting a proper assessment, getting a full assessment, a geriatric assessment, and so on. So there's ways to manage it, but you can't even start to properly manage it until you communicate. I agree. Okay, so we just want to talk, circle back a little bit as we continue to work through this indicia, these indicia categories. So the other one that we've talked about is, of course, cloistering. But more than cloistering and more than just holding the door is controlling the environment that your client is living in. And the checklist helps us a lot in giving us some teasing questions to help tease out the issue. But it's almost impossible to prove that the door is being held in a lot of these situations. But it isn't quite as difficult to see who's controlling the environment and how it's happening if you start to drill down on your daily activities. And it's an easy question to get into with clients, and certainly elderly clients, is that let's have some discussion about daily activities, which will help enhance us to see who's controlling your day, and therefore maybe we're not going to see the door slammed, but we're going to at least see what when manipulation could be around. So another one, the courts are looking at that. They want to know who controls the environment. They want to know, obviously, who's cloistering.
They are also looking for indicia of dependency on individuals, whether it is because of some physical impairment or some emotional impairment or otherwise. Knowing who's sort of in the circle of the day-to-day activity with this individual will help sort of drill down on what kinds of, what the environment is that they find themselves into and what opportunities are there for people to take advantage of them.
Another sort of interesting, and there's a couple of cases on this point, interesting indicia that the court hung on, was who's controlling the testamentary documents. And then the second part of that is who's controlling the actively holding the powers of attorney as well. And the court, there's a series of decisions that deal with that being another element and another important indicia of who's, not, that comes back to who's controlling the finances, comes back to who's controlling your day and all of that. And an easy way to dive into that area and to start that dialogue with your client is where's the wills going? Where's the power of attorney going? You want them here, you want them there, why do you want them here, why do you want them there? What is the impact of putting it in my safe, what's the impact of you taking it home, and so on. So those kinds of areas of inquiry, again, help us tease out the issues.
And then, of course, there's just what is the nature of the instruction that you're being provided? What are the kinds of changes that are being made to a will if it's a return situation? Are there some red flag instructions that you're receiving that just don't seem to sit right? And then it comes back to the gut check about, do we really need to drill down much further in terms of why this change is being made, in addition to just making sure that the individual understands what they're doing? So a couple of other ideas that come out of Dr. Shulman's work, and he's written a ton on this, and he's not the only person by any means, but we're sort of focusing on him because we love his sort of test and the theories are behind the test. But he also talks about the expectation of the lawyers to determine issues of personality. And that's not something that may come natural to us, and it isn't always the easiest set of questions in our checklist. But for example, the whole question is substance abuse, and what are we doing in terms of testing that side of the client's world? And then an easy illustration is the abuse or the use of alcohol, for example, or drugs. And he talks about some illustrations with drugs as well, and obviously the manipulation of the mind that a bad mix of drugs can have on an elderly person. But how are we teasing out the question of alcoholism? And it's something that is not prevalent in every case, but it's certainly a relevant and not uncommon issue. So he suggests that we should be, as lawyers, be mindful of that issue being sort of statistically and sort of socially realistic event that our clients could be suffering from, and where we should be doing our best to determine where and what that issue plays in their lives. And again, you can always tell that by coming back to our early questions about what are your day-to-day activities, what are you doing in a day, are you getting up, and you can hear and understand the nature of the way they're behaving. That can also take you through some elements of where you might be able to see that issue being more prevalent. So your personality of the individual is something that he reminds us that we can dive into without too much concern. And as you can imagine, these aren't going to necessarily be the easiest conversations to have, but having sort of a checklist and being sort of aware of the kinds of things that statistically people are telling us that elderly people will suffer from or be prone to, it does help us sort of tease out the issues during the course of our interviews.
And I think it really comes down to, again, as we dance around the Shulman suggestions, those sort of medical-based suggestions are founded on legal principles, and anything he writes, he's careful to write with co-authors who typically will have a lawyer as co-authoring it and so on. So he keeps it grounded. It's not entirely on some sort of flaky, not flaky, but esoteric medical grounds. But circling back then to the questions where we see the highlights of issues rising is this not forgetting the the core elements of what is an estate plan that goes wrong. And as lawyers, then we circle back and make sure that we can spend time with our clients looking at making sure that they, one of the elements, one of the easiest illustrations of a frequent cause of estate litigation, of course, is the lack of a comprehensive estate plan in and of itself. And by virtue of identifying the incompleteness of the plan is in and of itself, as Shulman says, you're drilling down on illustrations for your client to help tease out and teach them what an important estate plan for their purposes is going to be. And by teaching them and educating them, you're also giving an opportunity to yourself to learn more about their ability and their cognitive ability. And he says that there's nothing better than teaching a client or explaining to a client concepts, making sure they understand that concept, basic concepts or complex concepts depending on the client, to test in your own way your cognitive their cognitive ability, and you've got good notes of that teaching, you've got good notes of the questions that you asked, and you drill down on. So this idea that we can keep our comprehensive estate plan is fundamental to making sure that we're teasing out these issues.
And when we see illustrations of points in time where there may be inadequate planning advice that's being provided, where in addition to the legal stuff that we're doing, there's a room for having perhaps a financial advisor provide some information, or an investment advisor, seeing these opportunities to bring other people into the estate plan is also a value add that we can provide to our clients depending on, again, the situational complexity of their particular situation.
The other area that Suzanne is talking about, and it allows us to help tease out issues as well in terms of whether their cognition is sufficient for whatever estate plan we're doing, is to identify the assets and talk about the assets. An easy illustration is, of course, if they have a U.S. asset, and that obviously brings a big trigger to you in terms of from a estate planning standpoint, but it also gives you an opportunity, again, to determine nature of cognition and the nature of understanding of the effect of their asset. Nature and effect of their asset ties into the fact that the U.S. asset is a unique asset, and other assets like an RESP or something that has unique characteristics to it that you have an opportunity to drill down on. So assessing the assets is usually expected when you're taking instructions, but it's also a tool to help us determine levels of cognition and capacity. All right, so we're starting to wind down, so we wanted to leave a few minutes here at the end for any questions if people have them on the floor here, and if not, we can wind up with a few last areas of inquiry. But we sort of designed this to allow for some dialogue as well.
Hi.
Hi.
I was interested in your comments about influence as opposed to undue influence. I wonder if you expand on that a bit. I'm thinking of a situation where, for example, a spouse may say, honey, you should leave everything to me, not to your kids from your first marriage who haven't seen for 20 years. Is that influence or undue influence? Obviously, it's going to depend on a lot of other things, too,
Yeah.
like his health and that type of thing. But
No, it's a really good question, and it's where we're charged with making that delineation. And the nice thing is, and that's why we find it helpful to look at what indicia the courts are expecting. We can start to tease out some of those indicias that we've just talked about to determine whether or not it is over the top. Because on the face of it, in husband and wife influence / undue influence is simply the hardest. Judges are often married and they know that they live their life unduly influenced by their wives or husbands anyway. So, but I mean, it's natural that is the highest threshold typically for a judge to get over. So the short answer is, on the face of it, of course it's influence. It's not undue influence. But we allow, if we do use these categories of indicia, you can start to develop whether or not it is undue influence. And who knows if when they leave the room, he's screaming at her all day long, literally, and she's physically not able to get out of her chair, and she is basically beaten to the point of doing whatever he or she's being told to do. And where we can tease that out is looking to the surrounding financial advisors as well. Because maybe the accountant's the one who comes over and signs the tax returns or does the quarterlies, say. Sees these clients 4 times a year. You see them once. And they come in and they look perfectly happy. And, of course, it's just good old marriage tension. Yet the accountant says, you know what? When every time I go there, you wouldn't believe what's going on in that house. When I knock on the door, I can hear her screaming at him, or vice versa. You get an ability to test that out and tease it out a little bit by you start to look at the surrounding circumstances. So on the face of it, it's an easy answer. But if you look for the indicia, there's ways to drill it down, and I think ways to start to alert it. Ultimately, you may not be able to fix it, and you may not. We're not charged with being God, so we're not charged with actually, calling the police on them unless you have extreme circumstances, presumably. But I think that's the best way to do it, and that is don't take it at face value. And the last point I'll have before the question is also remind them that they're guaranteed to be litigating, and so. If you really want to do this, I need to tease this out a little. I need to understand this a little better, or else this is going to go down the hall, and Jordan Oldbaum's going to pick the file, and he's going to run with this thing and torture it for many, many fees that we'll defend and torture it right back at the same hourly rates.
Rod Ferguson, Midland. I have an unusual situation, and probably like many in the room, we're here because we have one of these situations and hoping to get some assistance, Ian, and thank you, and Susanna. I have a client who is a guardian, has a court-appointed guardian, and he now wishes, for a whole bunch of reasons, which I think are legitimate, to have those restrictions lifted. I'm a little bit concerned, and I note in your paper you talk about less restrictive measures, and I'd like you to elaborate on that if you could.
For sure. I think the key element to the Substantive Decisions Act, and every time a judge, when I'm in front of a judge, says to us, is that don't forget that the Act expressly says, whatever you do, you're supposed to take the least restrictive steps as possible. So whether it's full guardianship, mini guardianship, half guardianship, however you want to describe it, the paramount obligation of the Act says to protect the individual is fine, but to do that, you should do it with the least restrictive steps. So in a case where you have a scenario like that, I think that the least restrictive steps actually works much in your favor. The worry, of course, is that why is it being released, and maybe there is some undue influence behind the scenes, and maybe there's something that is pushing this agenda. But you have the statutory obligation to be seeking out the least restrictive. And we see that, and the Act expects you to be creative on that. Judges don't really understand it, and so it takes some time to walk it through. But there are ways to least restrict, less restrict. The problem is with anything, with capacity, is it's a tipping point. Once you're incapable, you're incapable. If you're not incapable, you're not incapable. Section 3 counsel helps. You get a counsel appointed for the individual, maintain the guardianship, but you have a separate counsel appointed. More restrictive and least restrictive, I've also seen management plans that allow individuals to spend up to X dollars. And as opposed to completely restricting them, you amend the management plan and says, fine, but we want him to be able to spend up to $5,000 a month, or whatever that makes sense. So you have the two elements to it, and that is, one, you can get counsel to be more active and maintain it. You can amend your management plan, and then thirdly, of course, is get a new assessment and release the individual entirely from the throngs of a capacity assessment, of a guardianship. So those are sort of ways that you can sort of work around it, and it always will depend on the individual circumstances. But it's a really good point, and it's a point that the courts expect us to do because the statute tells us to do, and that is look for the least restrictive.
And many times I think people forget that you can undo a guardianship order. If the individual has somehow regained cognition or capability capacity, there is a means by which you can go back to court and have that rescinded. So in addition to revising the management plan, you can actually have it removed. And depending on the individual circumstances, it may be the best way to deal with it.
And Section 78 says you can run just to court on that point alone, especially when you're already in a guardianship. So it gives you that right to say, order a new capacity assessment. So there's some fairly easy exit strategies available too. But it's a worry because what you might be creating is someone who is in that gray zone and is essentially vulnerable to now undue influence that we've been chatting about. Henry, did you have a question?
Yeah, I understand that we have to be aware of the red flags that should trigger a full and very, very focused capacity assessment. I want to step back and think of the situation long before that, our basic intake of the client. And I've always done the client intake interviews personally. I have a very detailed multi-page questionnaire, printed questionnaire that I do myself, and I do a full inventory of the client's assets and the client's family, basically, before I even get to will instructions. I understand that some lawyers send those questionnaires out and have the client fill it out themselves and then send it in, and that's the basis for the will instructions, and then they do basically the will signing only face-to-face. I'm concerned about that. I wonder what you think of that practice and how it might facilitate undue influence in some circumstances.
That's a great question, and yes, I know of lots of practitioners who do that as well. And I think it really comes down to just making sure that if that is your practice to send it out in advance, that you make sure that there is the opportunity when you're meeting with the client before the actual signing of the will, that you have this dialogue, that you maybe take their answers and test them against that, and see if they can provide that same information on their own volition. Because that is, one of the easiest ways, I think, to set up an undue influence situation. And to be able to, and again, it's going to depend. You're going to meet the individual, and you're going to have certain indicia, which is clearly you'll want to probe more just because it's obvious that you'll have to. And then when you've got those answers on the face of it, if you've got those open-ended questions, if you've got that dialogue started, it'll give you the opportunity to really delve down and probe to make sure that, yes, in fact, this is what they say, is what they're saying is what it is, and that it's true, and that it's what they want. So, you can't necessarily stop people from doing that, and it won't necessarily be wrong. In many situations, you've got people where there's just no concerns. It's probably an easier way and a less expensive way to get the will planning done anyways.
No, I agree 100%. I don't think there's any practice. We all have to make a living at this. And so if there's efficiencies that we can draw into the process of the intake, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the courts have said it's the day of execution that the capacity is fundamental. I mean, there are cases that talk about it's the day of the instructions, but without getting too fine a point. So you've got that opportunity at least once. So if you take that time at that point, using that backup information, it can be an effective and business-like way of taking instructions and doing wills. Yes?
Good morning. My name is Irina Koropenko-Ruben, and I have a question. Sometimes clients ask other professional advisor to attend the meeting where they given will instructions. Is there could be any issues or problems for that advisor attending a meeting? That's my question, because I'm preparing estate plans, and often clients ask, please accompany me, so I would like to clarify that.
I don't have any trouble with advisors coming to the meetings. And in fact, if used properly and the situation is right, it almost enhances your ability to tease out questions and understand them. If you feel at any point in time you need to meet alone with the client, there's nothing wrong with that either. And you can always say, look, you know what, we just like some time just to chat. We want to talk about some private stuff that I'm not sure. And then the client says, fine, and the client says no. I think, in fact, it's the role of the advisors, and it's the allied advisors that really do play a big part in estate planning now that we can't. I think we should be encouraging as opposed to discouraging, because they almost always will add value to the scenario, even if it's history that they know. They're usually on the front lines with these clients. I mean, if an insurance agent knows probably more about your client than you'll ever know. They've been around them more or whatever, those kinds of scenarios. So I don't have any trouble with that. Where it gets a little messy is the nature of the instructions. And if the nature of the instructions are, give all of my estate to the advisor's family foundation, and I know that sounds bizarre, but that's not an impossible scenario in real life. So that's the only areas where I start to get nervous. And when the advisor is giving too much of the information, and I say, look, you know what, I hear you, that's great, you know a lot more than you know a lot about this client, but I need to hear it direct, because a part of my role is to understand what the client's issues are. So those are the only two negatives I'd pull away from it. Otherwise, I really encourage it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My question is, what best practice do you think should be followed for the frequent situation where the person comes in with a family member, and you want to have the meeting first off with the person doing the will, but you're during the initial discussion, they say, well, no, I want my daughter here with me.
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's no easy answer. It's hard to discourage the family member from being in the room from an optic standpoint, a comfort standpoint, and it's easy for us litigators to say, oh my gosh, I can't believe you left the sister or the daughter in the room. That's outrageous and egregious, and we're going to take it to the Supreme Court of Canada. The real world is not that, and the real world is that people are often being assisted by their family members, and I think it's overplayed, and that's why, and I really do. I mean, I think that's why the indicia is much more sophisticated when you look at undue influence. It used to be the easiest way to illustrate undue influence was when you let the son in the room, and it was a classic. My dad has that great Law Society video that I'm sure some of us have seen that he did, where he mocked out a scenario where the son was in the room, basically giving all the instructions, and has that one moment in time where he takes his notes and just throws them in the garbage, and it was perfect. But the point being that that's just an easy way to show undue influence. It's actually more complicated than that, and so to just insist that the family member not be there at all times in all circumstances, I just think it's a rule that's not realistic. So we need to manage it. Obviously need to have special time with the client being in the room alone and so on. But I'm not sure that, like anything, I don't think there's anything hard and fast, and as long as you manage it properly and you have spent enough time with the individual without them being in the room, I think it can be managed after testing for undue influence. We'll take our last question, and then we got to wrap up.
This is we're pretty easy on that comment about having family members in the room. What I was going to ask the same question because it's a common situation. I'm sure we've all had it. I try and tell the testator that what we're trying to do is make an efficacious will,
Yeah.
and you want your will to stand up, don't you? And you, the family member, you want it to stand up, don't you? So if you don't mind, I'd invite you to go out, and that way we're all better off. Sometimes the testator says, no, I really want them to stay, and I think you would agree that so long as you've tested the influence and make sure that the person doesn't lead the conversation, you're okay. And on the second point, I try, when I have taking instructions, to send a draft will, out to the client after I've got the instructions so that they've got time to consider it. And hopefully the son, daughter doesn't rewrite the will for them, but assuming that when they came in, you were comfortable with the instructions and sent it out to them, you have further comfort, I think, in the sense that they've had the opportunity to review and reflect and make any changes, so that when they come back, if there's a gross change, you're going to wonder why. And that's my practice anyway, and it seems to work so that it also shortens the interview when they come back.
Yeah. Well, I agree. I think as long as there's time though alone, there has to be time alone with the client, and I think that's where we as litigators would have too much of a heyday. But those are that's an excellent questions all around. Appreciate everyone's attention. We want to wrap up in a timely way so we can all go back and earn a living. So thank you all very much, and we'll stick around if you have any personal questions. Thank you.